Hi, I'm Linda Hixon of the Hopedale Women's History Project, and I want to talk to you about Hopedale women and the fight for women's rights. And this was a presentation that was supposed to happen in 2020, in time for the 100th anniversary of women earning the right to vote in the United States. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And as grateful as I am to Hopedale Cable being able to do this for me, I have to say that I really enjoy being in front of an audience and doing a live presentation. I like the feedback. I like the question and answer period. That's my favorite. But we have to do what we have to do. So this is part one of a series. This one's called Speaking for Themselves. And just want to tell you that my group, the Hopedale Women's History Project, is a nonprofit, and we're dedicated to finding and sharing these stories of Hopedale women and also of Hopedale itself. It's not just about women, but women are an integral part of the founding of Hopedale and of Hopedale becoming what it became, which was one of the most powerful towns in the state, if not in the country and the world. And that story needs to be remembered, so that's my job. To start this part, I have to back up a little before Hopedale was founded. In Massachusetts, the Congregational Church was the powerhouse church. It was the most important church in the state. As a matter of fact, through 1820, congregational ministers were paid by taxes, which is something they stopped in 1820. Separation of church and state didn't seem to matter for a while there. But if you go through any older town in Massachusetts, you will see the big white church, usually on the common or in the center of town. There's one in Grafton. I looked up their address, and the address is actually Grafton Common. And I know there's one in Uxbridge, too. There's one in Milford. The Congregational Church was powerful and important. And in 1837, the General Association of Massachusetts Congregational Churches put out a pastoral letter. And what they're doing is they're denouncing women for speaking in public. The 1830s, you've got the beginnings of a real rise in abolition. Abolition movement against slavery, growing in the North. And women are maybe not leading it, but they are an integral part of it, including women from Hopedale. And the ministers from the Congregational Church decide they don't like women speaking. And so they say, and the letter is long, this is just one quote from it, "When she assumes the place and tone of a man as a public reformer, our care and protection of her seem unnecessary, and her character becomes unnatural." Personally, I think that the ministers should have shut up themselves, because this seems to have unleashed the idea that maybe women should start demanding rights in this country. The first women's rights rumblings start to happen in the late 1830s. And Hopedale, Maiden Blue and his practical Christian followers, the people who follow the religion that they've come up with themselves, start to see women as being an equal part of their religion. And the people who follow Maiden Blue had to sign something called the Standard of Practical Christianity. And it's all about families. It's all about equality. It's all about doing good deeds. And the third line of that standard is, our religion is love. Who can argue with that? We cannot neglect or abuse our families, nor evince any want of natural affection toward our bosom companion, our aged parents, or our helpless offspring. This is about families. And women came to Hopedale because they felt safe in Hopedale, because it was about families. This stereoscope is of the old house, which was the original building in Hopedale. It was part of the Jones Farms. It was a very big house. And when families first started moving to Hopedale, after they purchased their 300 approximate acres of this farm, they all lived together in the old house. You've got your first families moving in at the end of 1841. And most of the rest of the early followers of Aidan Blue, including Aidan Blue himself and Ebenezer Draper, come to Hopedale by April 1842. They're in town. They're planting food and getting ready to live together. And they made a constitution before they moved to Hopedale. They thought there were going to be many Hopedales, and they made a constitution. And one thing that constitution says, which is groundbreaking, is every member shall have one and but one vote on all questions. This means that they were giving women who came to Hopedale and were living in town and practical Christian members the right to vote on town matters, which is huge. This constitution was decades ahead of its time. It gave women almost total equality with men in town. All the members shall stand on a footing of personal equality, irrespective of sex, color, occupation, wealth, rank. That is huge. I mean, not only are they giving women equal rights in Hopedale, they're giving women of color and men of color equal rights in Hopedale. We will have a free black family that come and live in Hopedale in the early 1850s. There will be escaped slaves who come through Hopedale on their way to Canada. So Hopedale is this amazing progressive thing that gave women the right to serve. 32 members signed this constitution before Hopedale was founded, and 14 of those members were women, including Emily Gay, who was a single member, and she later became a doctor, a homeopathic doctor. So very cool that these women are doing this in the 1840s. It'll be another 80 years before women get the right to vote in the United States. In 1848, they decide to create a sewing circle. And this sewing circle was not originally an abolitionist sewing circle. A lot of the sewing circles that come about in the North at this time were abolitionists, but the original sewing circle was not. It was originally called the Hopedale Sewing Circle and Tract Society, and the tracts that they were producing were about their religion, practical Christian tracts, or tracts about non-resistance, because as practical Christians, they believed in non-resistance, which today we call it pacifism, but Aidan Blue hated that word. He said, we're not pacifists, we just don't believe in violence. And they were totally against war. And so a lot of the tracts that they purchased and distributed, they raised money to do that. A lot of them were on non-resistance, either written by Aidan Blue or Henry Wright, other writers. And what they would do is give these things away to spread the word, because that was part of their job as practical Christian members. In 1848, about 40 people sign up to be members of this original sewing circle, and almost half of them are men. The women worked for the cause, and the men had to pay dues every year. I think they paid about 50 cents a year in order to be part of the group. But in 1850, after a couple of years of doing this, something changes. And what happens is, if you back up just a little bit, in 1848, there was a women's rights convention held in Seneca Falls, New York. And the women of Hopedale knew about it. It had been in the papers. It was a local thing. And by 1850, there are rumblings that they want to have a national women's rights convention. And so in 1850, this convention is being talked about, and it's going to be held in Worcester. Well, Worcester's not that far away. And women figure they can travel and go to this convention. So the sewing circle shifts. It becomes a woman's place. 47 women sign on, which is more than double the women that signed on in 1848. And it's all women. Men will show up in the record, but they come to visit and to talk and bring their instruments and play some music. they're not working for the cause anymore. Becomes a safe space for women to talk about things. So before the 1850 convention, the newspapers start talking about other things that are happening in the country about women's rights. The Massachusetts Spy, which was a Worcester newspaper, noted in February of 1850 that a petition had been filed in the Massachusetts legislature in mid-January, and it was a petition of Alfred Wyman and 5 others, and of 16 women of Westminster, that the right of suffrage may be extended to women and that they may be made eligible to office. This is groundbreaking. Women in Hopedale are already petitioning the state legislature for the right to vote, and a petition has been filed in the Massachusetts legislature for that right to vote. This is a picture of Brindley Hall in Worcester. This is where the convention is going to be held. There was another convention in Ohio that happened before the one in Worcester, and they had several resolutions that they came up with in Ohio. And these things will happen at each convention where they'll resolve things that they want to have happen. The right of women to participate in the enactment of laws by which she is governed. That's an interesting one, because that's kind of what men and women were talking about during the Revolutionary War. Right? No taxation without representation, being able to participate in laws that are coming down from Parliament. This is what women want, but it's many, many years, decades after the Revolutionary War at this point. Women are also discussing in Ohio women in society, the fact that women seem to fall under, quote, a different standard of propriety and morality than men are held to. That women who have an idle, aimless life are involved in the guilt as well as the suffering of their own oppression. We're our own worst enemies sometimes. That those who go forth into the world in the face of the frowns and sneers of the public to fill large spheres of labor are the truest preachers of the cause of women's rights. So the 1850 convention in Worcester is considered the first national women's rights convention. And Anna Draper, the wife of Ebenezer Draper, attends. This is a picture of her looking a little bit dour, but I don't think Anna was like that. She and Ebenezer did not have any children of their own, although they adopted several. They seem to have loved children, and they adopted several kids and it's not legal adoption. They took them in. Kids that needed homes. She attends, along with Ebenezer. A lot of men attend. We've got a lot of women from Hopedale attending. Rebecca Provan, Elizabeth Dodge, Anna Fish, Catherine Munyon, Mary Davis, Mary Ann Walden, Lydia Wilmarth, and this is Elmira Humphrey. She also attended. I love Elmira. First of all, she's got little banana curls in her hair, and she's got a little bit of a grin on her face, which is something you don't always see in these photographs of the time, often because they had to sit for so long while the camera was taking their picture because the shutter speed was so slow. So it's awesome to see this picture of Elmira Humphrey. The Weekly Messenger ran an article about the convention about a week after it happened. And this is Paulina Wright Davis, and she was a women's rights advocate. She knew the women of Hopedale. She published a women's newspaper called The Una, and she was the chair of the convention. And the newspaper states that she read an address stating her views of the reform required. She insisted that it should be radical and universal, to be accomplished at once and not by degrees. It was to embrace the redemption of half the world and must be accomplished by the reorganization of all social, political, and industrial institutions. It would consequently be a movement without example among the reformations which have been accomplished. On the conclusion of this address, Mrs. Mott of Philadelphia, here's a picture of her here, rose and declared her opinion that it was the duty of the sex to claim their right in strong and decided terms. Now, this is not a picture of Mrs. Mott taken as an old woman versus Mrs. Wright taken as a young woman. Lucretia Mott was born in 1793, so she would have been 57 when this convention happened. Paulina Wright was born in 1813. She was 37. So this is a fight of generations that's happening. And one of the things they're fighting against is coverture laws. Now, coverture was this idea that married women have no separate legal identity once they get married. They basically become almost an appendage of their husband, almost a child. They're no longer an adult. They can't own property. They can't control their earnings. They don't get to sign contracts because he does it all. So these women are fighting against this. Women at this time had no legal right of their own children. If you ended up having to divorce your husband, and one of Hopedale's women did get a divorce in 1854. She didn't have children, so it didn't impact her that way. But if you had to divorce your husband, say, for abandonment or abuse, you could lose the right to ever see your children again. So these women are fighting against it. And one of the women in town who's very important in this is Abby Hills Price. Now, Abby was an early member of the Hopedale community. In 1843, she was the secretary of Hopedale's Board of Trustees. Now, that's poo-pooed today, and it shouldn't be, because if you look at Aidan Ballew's history of Hopedale, and he lists the officers for that year of the Board of Trustees, Aidan Ballew is first because he's president. Abby Hills Price is second as secretary. Now, Aidan Ballew isn't doing that to be nice. He's listing people in order of importance. And Abby Hills Price as secretary, yes, she may have taken notes, but she also basically ran the town when he wasn't there, and he wasn't there a lot. Of course, she wasn't there a lot either because she was a very active abolitionist speaker. She actually spoke at an abolitionist meeting in Upton with Frederick Douglass, so she knew everybody in the abolitionist movement. And she speaks at the 1850 National Women's Rights Convention. She gives a keynote speech on the first day of the convention, and she uses the words of the Declaration of Independence to demand co-equality with men. She says women ought to have equal opportunities with men for suitable and well-compensated employment, that women ought to have equal legal and political rights, franchises, the vote, and advantages with men. She's also talking about her daughters. She had daughters and sons, and she knew the difference that her children were going to face when they became adults. Compared with sons, their chances for an honest livelihood are few. Now she's talking about her daughters. Though they may have intellect of a high order, yet they must be educated to be married as the chief end of their being. Give girls a fair chance to acquaint themselves with any business they can well do. Our daughters should fit themselves equally with our sons for any post of usefulness and profit that they may choose. She wants women, this is 1850, to get equal pay for equal work. Wow, what a concept. She's also talking about women who lose that male support. You're widowed, you're abandoned, your husband isn't providing for you, your father, if you're not married, dies. What are you going to do? What's your job opportunities out there? Well, you could be a seamstress, a dressmaker. Of course, seamstresses make way less than a tailor, even though women's clothes are much more complicated and difficult to make. But you could do that. You could be a domestic. You could be a house cleaner or a cook. You could go work in the mills. The reason that they're hiring the mill girls in Lowell at this time is because it's cheaper to hire girls than it is to hire men. So you could do that. Or you could become a prostitute, and she actually uses that word in her speech. Necessity. We are compelled to believe cruel necessity often drives her to vice, especially in our large cities, as the only alternative from starvation. Deplorable and heart-sickening as the statement is, I have good authority for saying that more than half of the prostitutes of our towns are driven to that course of life from necessity. Abby also, bless her, talks about living in Hopedale and the fact that women in Hopedale have the right to vote. I'm happy to feel that in the little commonwealth where I live, all persons have equal rights in public deliberations. Men and women are alike recognized as having a common interest in public offices and public measures. Hence, our annual meetings and elections are quiet and orderly. I have never, in the small state of Hopedale, heard of one home being neglected or one duty less thoroughly attended to by allowing women an equal voice. There was the argument that women shouldn't have the right to vote because then their housework would fall off and nobody'd take care of the kids. Obviously, that's not true. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is seated in this photograph, she knew Abby Hills Price. Abby Hills Price knew, as did many of the women in Hopedale, most of the women's rights women at this point in time. Abby H. Price, large-hearted and large-brained, gentle and strong, presented an address on the social question not easily forgotten and seldom to the present time bettered. She wrote this in a book that was co-authored by several women on the women's rights movement. It had a whole section on the national convention in Worcester. And she wrote about Abby, and that's where we get the list of who attended from Hopedale this convention. Mrs. Abby H. Price of Hopedale made an address on the injustice of excluding women from the colleges, the trades, and the professions, and the importance of training them to some profitable labor and thus to protect their virtue, dignity, and self-respect by securing their independence. She thought the speediest solution to the vexed problem of prostitution was profitable work for the rising generation of girls. The best legislation on the social vice was in removing the legal disabilities that cripple all their powers. Woman, in order to be equally independent with man, must have a fair and equal chance. And that's awesome to have that written about. We know that approximately 20 people from Hopedale attended this convention. It could have been more, but there are about 20 names listed in this book. Think about that. In 1850, there were about 200 people living in Hopedale. That's about 10% of the population going up to Worcester to attend a convention. That would be like 600 people leaving Hopedale today to go and attend the same convention. Kind of awesome. There was yet another National Women's Rights Convention that was held the next year in Worcester again, and there was an ad in the Massachusetts Spy in August because the convention was in October. Dare to give such a movement, the women's rights movement, the sanction of their presence and to embody in words and deeds the thought and feeling which they must have, who see that woman, socially, civilly, religiously, and educationally occupies an unnatural and unworthy position. The Boston Weekly Advertiser wrote about Abby giving yet another speech at the 1851 convention. Mrs. Price of Hopedale read a report on the Industrial Associations of Women, in which the subjects of employment, wages, etc. were handled. Her remarks were not very complimentary to the so-called nobler sex, men. She was in favor of all offices in the state government being open to women, and also of their being admitted to the pulpit, the bar, and the bench. So ministers, lawyers, and judges. Let women be all these things. I don't have a copy of Abby's 1851 speech. I wish I do, because when she's talking about industrial associations of women, she's talking about Hopedale. In Hopedale, everybody worked. Hopedale wasn't just Ebenezer Draper working in the little red shop making textile equipment. That's not what Hopedale was about. Hopedale had a bunch of different industries, and women worked in them. They had a printing shop. They grew market. They had a market stall in Milford where they sold their extra vegetables and fruit that they grew. They made boxes. They sewed shoes. The women in the sewing circle did straw braiding for hats. They did lots of stuff, and the women were paid equally with the men. Now, this is a picture of Abby Kelly Foster of Worcester. She attended these conventions too. She is Worcester's big women's rights advocate and abolitionist speaker. She knew Abby Hills Price. She knew a lot of the women in Hopedale. She spent time in Hopedale because her sister, Lydia Kelly Earle, lived in Hopedale and was one of Aiden Blue's followers. Lydia had been widowed, and she moved to Hopedale because it was a safe place to live. Hopedale promised to take care of its widows and its orphans, and if you needed medical help, they'd take care of that too. It really was a place where this early version of socialism worked for 15 years, and women were safe there. In 1852, the Sewing Circle, in which these women all belonged to, they met at Sylvia Bancroft's house, and they spent the afternoon, this is the record, spent the afternoon in sewing for Mrs. A.H. Price. Mrs. Anna T. Draper read a very interesting piece on women's rights. There were lots of pieces in the local paper on women's rights at the time. I found this in a newspaper archive from the Boston Daily Bee, June 29th, 1853. Constitutional Convention was happening, and a petition had been filed. Mr. Green of Brookfield presented the petition of Abby H. Price and 45 others, women of Hopedale, and that of Betsy T. Hayward, and 92 others, women of Milford, severally in aid of petitions that women may be allowed to vote on the proposed amendments to the Constitution. Now, this is the state constitution. They rewrote it every few years, and the women want to be able to vote so that they can put in women's rights stuff in the Massachusetts Constitution. And this is an awesome thing that Abby presented this, had a man present this petition, and women in Milford were also involved. William Lloyd Garrison was a supporter of women's rights, and Abby wrote several articles for his newspaper, The Liberator, because she was an abolitionist speaker. And she wrote about Women's Rights Convention in 1853. I claim, this is actually Garrison writing about the convention in 1853. I claim to be a human rights man, and wherever there is a human being, I see God-given rights inherent in that being, whatever may be the sex or complexion. So he's like Aiden Blue. Equal rights. It doesn't matter if you're a woman or if you're African American. Doesn't matter. The original Sewing Circle record is very short, and I use that for a basis of a lot of my stuff, but we know that Sarah Holbrook got a divorce in that record, and we also find them talking about a woman's right to her child. So we know the women are talking about women's rights things. There is no good photo of Abby that I've been able to find in Hopedale. One appeared in Putnam's Monthly, which was a Connecticut magazine in 1908, because there was an article on Walt Whitman, and Abby became one of his friends after she left Hopedale. And her daughter spoke about it in a newspaper called The Sun in November of 1908. A number of letters written by Walt Whitman at the time of the Civil War appear in Putnam's magazine for November. The letters are written to his mother and his intimate friend, Mrs. Abby Hills Price. Mrs. Price's daughter writes concerning them, "I was sure you would feel as I do that nothing has been printed regarding Walt Whitman which shows him in so winning and attractive a light. And it must be true of the man, too, for we all saw him in his home in Brooklyn as well as in our own for many years, and we never saw anything in him in any way inconsistent with the character revealed in those letters, generous, sympathetic, affectionate, and proud." Hopedale's women would continue to fight for women's rights right through the end, but none of these women from that first Sewing Circle record from that first convention would live to use their right to vote. I want to thank you for joining me for Our Own Worst Enemy, 3 Generation of Hopedale Women's Fight for Women's Rights. This was part 1, Speaking for Themselves. Thank you to the Hopedale Cultural Council and the Massachusetts Cultural Council for supporting this presentation. Many of the images you've seen came from the Library of Congress website, which is awesome. I suggest you going there. Great pictures, great info. Also from the Bancroft Memorial Library and the Little Red Shop Museum. Thank you so much for sharing your images for this presentation. For more information, or to let me know what you'd like to say, you can visit my website and contact me, hopedalewomen.org. I'm Linda Hixon, founder of the Hopedale Women's History Project. Thank you for joining me. Take care.